I say we're trying to get quite a bit covered. I think we should be able to do it if we don't get bogged down too much. And I mean by that, if I don't get bogged down too much. Because it all flows together fairly well, especially after we get past chapter 4. Chapter 4 is anyway, as we've already seen. Okay. Last week, just a quick reminder. We're in Ezra chapter 4, about verse 6, so somewhere around the 6, 7 is where we left off last week. What I need to remind everybody of, excuse me, is that verses 6 through most of the rest of the chapter is Ezra basically summarizing some of the other problems that have occurred in terms of their neighbors causing them problems. Their neighbors trying to stop them from building the temple. At the beginning of chapter 4, their neighbors came by and said, "Can we help?" They declined that help. And so what does the neighbors turn around and do? They do the best they can to try to get them to quit anyhow. And so we're going to look at some of what we're looking at now are some of the things that happened on through other kings and so forth. And so we need to make sure we understand it that way. Otherwise, this section makes no sense whatsoever. It gets you really confused about the timeline. So, chapter 4, verse 6, it mentions a letter that was sent to Cyrus or Xerxes. That was one king that is actually, we're still in the time period of Cyrus, but Xerxes is like two, if I'm remembering correctly, 2, maybe 3 kings later. Then we'll see about a letter that was sent to Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes is the one that follows Xerxes. Okay? And then the next verse, well, before that, we're going to say, notice this. Notice that in verse 7, it says, the letter was written in Aramaic. It was not written in the language of the Persians would typically write it in. Okay? Anybody want to venture a guess as to why they would suddenly write the letter in a different language, in Aramaic?
Jews couldn't read it.
No. Sorry. Because you got to remember, this is a time when they could read multiple languages and so forth. But why Aramaic? Any guesses? All right, let's go ahead and tell you, because otherwise we're going to waste a lot of time. That was the official diplomatic language. If you wanted to be correct as far as diplomacy was concerned, you wrote it in Aramaic. And this is a letter written to Artaxerxes. Okay? He's the king. So we're going to be formal about this. We're going to write the letter in the right language. Interesting thing is, though, when it's read to Artaxerxes, what do they have to do? They have to translate it back to something he can really understand very well. But it was written in Aramaic because that was the official diplomacy language. Okay. Now, verse 8. We're going to look at a letter. This one we've got. This is another letter written to Artaxerxes. And this one we're going to spend a little time with, hopefully not too terribly long, or we'll never get done. So look at, just for a moment, at verse, starting at verse 8. Now we know this is a different letter than the one for verse 7, because it's written by some different group of people. Okay, it's still the same person it's being written to. It's still being written to Artaxerxes, but it's written, I'm not going to try to read these names, but you'll see it's a different group of names that it's written to. Now, jump down to verse 11, and you'll see here, this is a copy of it. And that's what we're going to discuss briefly. And I'm going to do a lot of paraphrasing here. Notice it is from, in verse 10, as they're in the first part of this letter, they're addressing it to Artaxerxes, and they're saying who it's from. And it says in verse 11, it's from the men of the region beyond the river, and so forth. Here's the next question. All right, who are the people beyond the river? This is the same ones. This is what area that we talked about last week. It's also talked about in the New Testament. It was the area that all the Jews went around. I'm giving you all kinds of hints here. Samaria. This is the land of Samaria. Okay? Well, what I want us to understand is where this area is. Okay, so here's a map that hopefully will help us figure that out. There we go. Now, my pointer last time wouldn't work, so I got a new one. All right. Jerusalem is the area where this is all taking place. This is where the temples begin built. It's in this area right here. The river they're referring to is the Euphrates. This is the Euphrates. Okay? Most of Persia is up this direction, so the land beyond the river is the land on this side, or the west side, of the Euphrates. So all in that area right there is the area we're talking about where Samaria is. Oh, and if you're curious, we talked about, this is a map I think I showed you before. This was where Babylonian kingdom was. It spread then when Persia took it to all this other stuff all the way out here. But anybody wonder why this is blank right here? Nothing, big wide area? Anybody know what that is?
Desert.
Desert, exactly.
My version says Euphrates. From your servants of Euphrates.
Okay.
And transferred some of them down there probably.
Yeah, well, the area they're talking about is this area on the west side of the Euphrates. That's where we're talking about. Okay, so now hopefully you got that picture in your head as we continue. All right, this is the cities of Samaria beyond the river, and we're going to look at the copy of that letter. Now, as you look down through the letter, 11 through 16. Again, I'll never get through all this if I read all this verbatim. But look down here, and I'm going to paraphrase kind of the things that they're saying. Let it be known, the king of the Jews, that there's these Jews over here. They're building this building and so forth in Jerusalem. Look at verse 13. If they continue, they're going to build walls. It's going to be completed, and they're going to what? What are they not going to do? They're not going to pay taxes. Okay, and treasury is going to be diminished. They're asking for support and so forth. So, the writers of this letter, what do they seem to be afraid of? Now, they're making it sound like you're not going to get the taxes and all this kind of stuff. But what are they really afraid of?
Afraid that they might get control of them again.
Yeah, they're afraid they're going to get control of this area again, and they're going to try to get rid of them, as was done by the forefathers. That's what they're really afraid of. So, they make all these accusations. And as you look at verse 16, how do they slant it to the king to make it sound like this is in his best interest?
You won't get no money.
You won't get any money. If we don't stop this, you're not going to get in your taxes. You're not going to get money. So that's what the whole idea that he's trying to do here.
They also kind of giving him the idea you're going to lose control and
You're going to lose
possession
control
of these lands.
Exactly. You're going to lose control. They're slanting it in such a way that it's in the king's best interest to stop.
Is that what we call kissing up to the king?
You could say that.
Kinda.
Yep, that's exactly what they're doing. Okay?
Sounds like the devil's words, kinda, don't it?
Yep. Okay. And look at verse 17. What is the king's answer? Excuse me.
He's gonna investigate it.
He's going to investigate. He's going to investigate, first of all, if these people have this kind of history. Because that's where the accusations they've made is they have a history of rebelling against kings and doing that kind of stuff. So he's going to investigate it. Okay? As it goes on down through here. In verse 19, he says he gave a search to see if these things were true. Also in verse 20, there have been mighty kings over Jerusalem who have ruled over the region beyond the river, and tax, tribute, and custom were paid to them. But ultimately, what is the decision? Make them stop. Make them stop. Ultimately, make them stop.
Act like it's in man's hands to control everything.
Yeah, well, they think he's the king. He's the king of Persia, so he thinks he is. Okay, so Artaxerxes does order them to stop all the things they're doing. To cease. Okay. Verse 23, the orders were sent back to the senders. Stop what's going on. So what do? They do. They have them stop. Verse 23, not only do they have them stop, but, look at the last couple of lines of verse 23. They went up in haste to Jerusalem against the Jews, and by force of arms, they made them stop. Now, again, this is talking about later from Artaxerxes, and that was going on then. Okay? Now, in verse 24, we're going to get back to the time period that this whole thing was happening. So, all of that between up through verse 23 has been a kind of summary of these are the things that are much trouble that these neighbors are going to cause over the next many years. Now we get back, and that's the last verse of the chapter, and we get to the idea of back to the time when these neighbors wanted to help, but they were told they couldn't. Okay? But notice what does happen. The construction does stop. So it's real easy to look at verse 20, the last verse, 24, and think it's pertaining to the letter. It's not. It's pertaining to what actually happened during the time of Cyrus, when all this started, and so forth. So, construction does stop. So we end from chapter 4 with construction ceases. So, let's look at a couple of, then it goes on to say, this is last days until the reign of Darius. So construction actually stops, you see in verse 24, and it stops until the second year of the reign of Darius. So let's go back to, I guess in there. That was about 15 years. So when the neighbors came by and said, we want to help you build the temple, and they were told, nope, you can't, they caused such a mess that with the letters and that, with everything they did, that they caused the stop of the temple construction for about 15 years. Just to stop them.
If you're gonna do right, you can expect opposition.
Yep. Okay, so let's go back quickly to this. We started off in the time period of Cyrus. Then we jumped ahead through Xerxes, Artaxerxes, talking about some letters that were written to them. Then we've come back now, in the last verse of this chapter, we've gone back to this period of Cyrus and what's going on. But again, construction did stop. Okay. Application. We're going to go through this pretty quick. God's work can be stopped by opposition. Is God's work ever stopped by opposition today? Sure it is. Okay? Somebody thinks it's a bad idea, or somebody in the area thinks it's, threatens you in some way, and the work stops.
Our Supreme Court's got a whole lot of it.
Yeah? Yeah. And here's the question. How does opposition succeed? In this case, how did it succeed?
Let them beat you.
What did it do to the people to cause them to stop? Was it arms alone that got them to stop? Fear. They were afraid. Remember, I talked earlier about they were afraid of it. They were scared, and that's what caused it to stop.
Well, there's opposition also in that situation, like nowadays, and then they just tell lies.
Oh yeah. Lies were told and so forth, but bottom line, they were scared. That's what it amounted to. Okay. Anything else before we jump into chapter 5? All right. Chapter 5 is going to pick up where the last verse in chapter 4 left off, basically. So we're not going to do any of this stuff jumping way ahead and talk about what's going to happen many years later. Chapters 5 and 6 all flow together, so hopefully I can get them to flow together. Chapter 5, verse 1. We've got a couple of other people who show up on the scene here. Then the prophet Haggai and Zechariah, the son of Iddo, prophets prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, who was over them. Okay. We could easily, and I'm not even going to attempt to do this, we could easily go to both of these minor prophets and find out exactly what Haggai and Zechariah did while they were there. Their bottom line mission was, they were sent from God to get them back to work. That's the bottom line. Now, these two had different ways of doing it. Haggai was very straightforward. You might say it was basically the approach of get to work. You're getting lazy. You've got something to do. Get back to work. That type of approach. Zechariah was a little bit different approach. His approach was to encourage. His approach was to tell them the benefits of what they were going to do. His approach was, in some cases, even to prophesy things that were going to happen on down the line. Okay, we're going to get back to that kind of stuff, hopefully, if we finish this chapter. But they had two different approaches to how they were going to get them busy. Bottom line, they got back to work. Zerubbabel and Jeshua led the people to begin to rebuild the temple. Verse 2. Okay? Now, remember those neighbors? They ain't gone away. We're going to see that they pitch a fuss again. Okay? Now we're going to get with the neighbor's going to include. Now, before it was basically just citizens in that area. Now we're going to involve somebody else, and that is the governor. Tenenai, I don't know if that's how I pronounce it or not, but the governor of the region beyond the river is the one that's going to get involved. So he's the one that he's the one that's directly got to answer to the king. He gets involved. They've started back working. It's been about 15 years. They have finally got back to working. So he's going to ask a question. In verse 3, basically the question is, who told you to go back to work? Under whose authority, basically, are you working? Which was, I guess, a fair question. Okay? And look at verse 4. Like any good governor is going to do, or person in authority, he not only wants to know who told you, but he wants names. You know, I'm going to write down names. I'm going to find out. Do you have authority to do this? So what do you think he's eventually going to do?
Send it back.
Hmm?
He's gonna send it back first.
He's going to write a letter of his own. That's what we're going to see in just a moment.
That governor was probably appointed by Persian too.
Mhm.
They
It was
picked
appointed- it
out
was-
their big leader in their
Exactly.
people.
Yeah, he was appointed by probably the king.
So he was afraid of Persian as much as Persian.
But what I wanted you to notice this time, this is an official that's actually asking the questions, not just the everyday citizens over there trying to stir something up. Excuse me. I want you to look at verse 5. Verse 5 is an interesting verse. He's asked, first of all, who gave authority to get started, and I want names. Then look at verse 5. But the eye of their God was upon the elders of the Jews, so that they could not make them cease till a report could go to Darius. Then a written answer was returned concerning this matter. So this governor is going to send a letter. They convinced him, send a letter. But until we get a letter back, what did they do? They kept working. They didn't do what they did last time. Okay. So here they send the letter. Now keep this in mind. This letter, as you look at the letter, we're going to look at the letter. This letter that is sent to the king is written by this guy, the governor. And he's going to give a description of what he has noticed and what he has been told by the Jews. Okay? That's what I want you to notice. All right, verse 8. Let it be known to the king that we went into the province of Judah to the temple of the great God, which is being built with heavy stones and timber and being laid in the walls, and this work goes on diligently and prospers in their hands. In other words, he's saying they're doing a very good job of building this building. That's basically what he's saying. All right? So that's the first thing he does. He describes the actual work. And then he gets into the conversation he has with the Jews. Basically, he asks them, who gave you this authority? I got names and so forth. And, okay, verse 9. Yeah. He says, who commanded you to build this building? This is in the letter now. He is saying, I asked them, who gave you this authority? And they got names, so forth. Then look at verse 11. Thus they returned us an answer, saying, we are the servants of God, heaven and earth. And we are rebuilding the temple that was there before by the great king, the Jewish king. Of course, that was Solomon. So they first start off, we're the servants of God, heaven and earth, and that's why we got started building this to begin with. Look at verse 12. But because our fathers provoked the God of heaven to wrath, he gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. So when the temple was destroyed. So, what do the Jews seem to be doing?
Repenting.
Exactly. That's exactly what they're doing. They're saying, our fathers messed up. They didn't do what they were supposed to do, and as a result, we were punished by Babylonian captivity. Okay?
It's important what the governor's doing there too. He's telling it like it is.
He's telling it exactly.
One way or the other.
Exactly. He is simply putting in this letter what he has been told by the Jews, which is giving Darius correct information instead of one-sided information. Okay? He goes on to say in verse 13 through 15, and I'm going to paraphrase a lot of this. In the first year of Cyrus, then, our forefathers didn't know what they were supposed to do. We got into Babylonian captivity because of it. Then, the first year of Cyrus, he let us go. Not only did he let us go, but he gave us back all of our treasures from the temple. He gave us funding to do it and permission to leave and go back and build the temple. Tells them all of that. And at this point of the letter that's being written, he says, so far, they've laid the temple foundation, but the progress on that has stopped. That's all basically they got at this point. Okay? Look at verse 17. Remember, this is that governor that's writing the letter. He puts it in the correct way a governor should put it when we're talking to the king. He says, if it seems good to the king, let a search be made in the king's treasury house, which is there in Babylon, whether it is so that the decree was issued by King Cyrus. So very diplomatically, he's not telling him, you need to search this. He's asking, if it's your pleasure, would you search and find out if this is true? That's basically what he's saying. Okay. And that's essentially where chapter 5 ends. Quick application. 2 prophets were sent. Haggai and Zechariah. Because they had different methods. They had different methods of doing it. Is it a good idea sometimes to hear messages in different ways?
Yes.
Does everybody respond the same way?
No.
No. I mean, I could stand up here and tell some people, an orders to do something, and they're going to do it just because I said so. Others need a little more persuasion. Why?
Said something over there in the micro revelation on down in there about cowardly.
We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that part in just a moment. But there were the 2 ways of doing it, and I learned early in my career teaching, you couldn't teach a lesson to a group of students the same way all the time because you only got part of it. You had to figure out multiple ways of addressing the same information because we all have different ways of understanding and doing so. Did they learn from their mistakes the first time? First time when they quit, they were scared. What did they learn? This time they were asked to stop and they didn't. They kept going. What did they learn?
Keep pushing up.
Because
Right.
trust God. Keep working. Okay? So they learned from their first mistakes. That 15 years prior, when they quit because of fear, they've learned. Because God was with his people. They finally figured that out. He's going to be with them. And there's an interesting term. The eye of God that is mentioned here. So, all right, quick question. What is the eye of God?
He was helping the government for one thing.
Okay?
All seeing.
All seeing, all knowing. Is that another way of basically saying that God was directing them and comforting them through this whole thing?
God's will.
Does he do that today?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Same thing. Same thing today. Okay. So 5 ends with a letter written and sent back to Darius. Okay?
But the governor that wrote the letter,
Uh-huh.
says, let's see, when he went to, the province of Judah, to the house of the great God,
Mm-hmm.
he realizes, he expresses himself as if he believes in this God, so why would it upset him so much
That they're building it?
that they want to build a place that's special to God?
He
The
was
devil believes God.
He was a
too.
governor, and he wouldn't probably have fooled you, he might have been part Jew, but he wouldn't have fooled you, that governor.
Yeah.
And he was more or less taking care of the king, because he would get in trouble.
And also the fact, just because he said he was the great God did not necessarily mean he believed in that great God.
He would just read.
He was addressing it, this is the great God, referring to the God that these Jews, that he is the great God. But he is not acknowledging necessarily that he believes in that God.
But to express it that way would lead you to believe that he even existed.
Exactly. But remember,
The devil believes
Cyrus
that,
did the
but he's
same
not
thing
gonna
earlier.
repent.
Cyrus did exactly the same thing earlier, said, this is the great God. In fact, Cyrus even took credit for the fact that this God spoke to me and told me to.
Yeah.
The devil fears God too, but he don't respect him.
Yeah, that is true. All right, now, chapter 6. We got here, maybe we'll finish it. So the king, King Darius, after getting this letter, he issues a decree to find out just what did Cyrus actually decree this? Did Cyrus actually give him all this stuff back and told him to go build it and so forth? So that's what we're going to see in chapter 6. Then King Darius issued a decree, and a search was made in the archives, which were in the treasures where were stored in Babylon. Verse 2. And at my version here says Akmatha, in the palace that is in the province of Media, a scroll was found and it was recorded. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. My question is, this says at Akmatha, do any of you have a different name here?
Mine just says House of Scrolls, but it's called.
Okay, but I mean for this city.
Right.
For this city.
Mine, I can't say it. It's ECBATANA.
Yeah.
Okay, good. NIV?
Potato.
I mean, is that the NIV version?
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. I was hoping at least somebody had it.
It says an agent captain of India too.
You're exactly right. That's what we're going to get. That's what we're going to get to. Okay. Caught up on my notes now, maybe. Okay. This city right here is also known by that name, and it is, here we go, back to this map. Well, that right there. Ekbatana. Again, I'm probably butchering it all to pieces.
Ekbatana.
Ekbatana. Okay.
Ekbatana.
That sounds better than what I said.
We gotta get running started.
That's true of a lot of these names. It really is. Okay. So the city we're talking about that they found Cyrus's original decree was Ekbatana. Okay? Now, remember, the letter's been sent from Jerusalem to Ekbatana. That's one, right? Okay. Hang on, folks. Hope you got your seatbelt on. It was sent here. He had a search made. He found it. The interesting thing is what he finds. The first thing he tells them in verse 7 is, after he finds what actually Cyrus had written, verse 7, he tells them to what?
Work in the house alone.
Leave them alone. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. I got it here. I got the scroll that says that Cyrus actually, sent this decree. So leave them alone. That's the first thing he tells them. Here's what I think is interesting. Look what he tells them in verses 8 through 10. He tells them, whatever is needed for construction or offerings will be paid for out of the taxes of who?
Them.
The province. In other words, the very people that have been complaining. Oh, you know that had to sit real well with them. Right?
When
They
God
don't
said,
set that well today, so I don't think they set that well back then.
It wouldn't have said that well at all.
when God said 70 years, that's what it was.
Yep. And here's but the thing about this is the very people that now are complaining that they're building it are going to have to pay for it. Boy, I know that just thrilled them to death. They had to pay for it. Okay? And then looked at verses 11 through 12.
Brother James, those people were still working over there, doing whatever they did.
Exactly. They didn't quit.
Profit, give it back to the king, they just refer it back to them.
Exactly.
And he said he made a decree. Decree is just like a law. And they made a law, they're going to do it when they want to.
Exactly. And a decree made by one king in Persia, a later king couldn't undo it. That was one thing. They couldn't do it. They couldn't undo it. Okay. Look at verses 11 through 12. If anyone alters this edict, well, they're just going to get a slap on the wrist, right?
Oh, no, they're going to hang him.
Yeah, verses 11 through 12. I'll try to get at least this because this is interesting to read. Excuse me. I also decree that whoever alters the city, let a timber be pulled out of his house. In other words, they're going to tear down his house and erect it, and let him be hanged on it. So they're going to tear down his house and they're going to hang him on the timber so he can kill him. Crucify him, essentially. What they're going to do. That should have deterred him a little bit. And he ends notice he ends, I like the way it ends in verse 12. I, Darius, issue a decree, let it be done diligently. In other words, don't miss a dot or not cross a T or anything. Make sure it is done exactly what I said that you do. So verses 13 through 15, we see the completion of the temple.
This version says impaled on the pole.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty rough.
Yeah.
That's like the Babylonians did.
Yeah, that's what the Babylonians did. Okay? So, 13 through 15, we see the temple is completed. And here we go. Remember it was 70 years. They were in captivity. Well, guess what? How long did it take them to actually build, to get all this stuff done? 70 years, about 70 years before they actually completed the temple. that was from the destruction of it till now. Okay. Verses 16 and 17, we have a dedication of the temple. Almost there. We have a dedication of the temple. And the dedication of the temple is going to involve a lot of sacrifices. We're going to briefly talk about next week about all those sacrifices and so forth, and we'll get through it. I will say one thing before we get dismissed. Chapter 6 ends the first section of Ezra. And then we will start the second section, which actually involves more directly Ezra. Y'all have a nice day and go eat. Go eat something.